Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 5, Section 1. And the title of this is Experimenting with Confederation. You see, as the Americans gained their independence from Great Britain, the next question was, what type of government should we set up? We all agreed that a monarchy was not going to work. In fact, part of the reason for our revolution was we did not feel represented by the British Crown. And so we adopted a system of government called the Articles of Confederation, based on the document with the same name. And this new style of government proved too weak to solve many of the nation's problems. But there are specific reasons why we created this style of government, and understanding this will help us understand a number of major events in our country, including the American Civil War. So first off, as colonies became states, people considered each colony, or now state, to be a separate political unit. So there was no United States of America, not in practice, though we might have used that name. Each of these states were considered different countries, and so state and country were interchangeable at this point. So separate political units. Colonists, well now American citizens, considered their loyalty to their colony, or now their state, to be most important. More important, in fact, to their loyalty to the entire country. So instead of calling yourself an American, you would call yourself a North Carolinian first. And that would be your first loyalty. And then, okay, whatever, for conversation's sake, you would consider yourself an American. It's much the same way that we think of ourselves as American, but yeah, okay, so we're on the North American continent, whatever, right? We all share that same half of the world, whatever, but we don't really identify with Canadians. We don't really identify with people from Mexico or the Caribbean, etc. We don't. However, we share the same space and some common factors, but our loyalty first is to the United States. Again, that's how colonists felt about Rhode Island or North Carolina or Virginia. And this idea persists, not only after the Revolution, but continuing forward through the Articles of Confederation and even culturally into the American Civil War. Now, colonists believed that democracy gave too much power to the uneducated. You know, I've read the old Thomas Jefferson quote for you many, many times, where Jefferson said that democracy requires an educated citizenry. And if we think them not enlightened enough, the remedy is not to take that power from them, but to inform their discretion through education. And Jefferson was responding to a number of Americans who still felt close political and cultural ties to Great Britain, who felt that the average American just was not educated enough to make informed decisions about who should lead them. Does it ever scare you about some wackos that wind up in power?
Yes.
I mean, and we're not naming names, we're not going there. I mean, really, when you get to state and local elections, it's a lot scarier than the big ones. For example, the head of the school board in my hometown can't read or write. It's a little concerning. You know, for example, man running for office in my hometown. Gosh, this is kind of, I hate saying this, but a man running for local office in my hometown put up a big billboard in front of his place of business saying, "Make America White Again." Rather racist. He was told to take it down, but in all likelihood he might still win. You see, state and local elections are rather scary too. Sure, the national ones get a lot of attention, but the point being that it is concerning And what do we often attribute to the fact that we get wackos in power from time to time? We often just blame it on the uneducated masses that just go for whatever's shiny, right? Well, that critique has been around for a very long time. In fact, when our founding fathers were setting up our government, they said, you know what? The American public just goes after the shiny thing, and that's not good for democracy. That's just going to wind up with wackos. We can't trust that type of government. It's called demagoguery, where everybody yells, and whoever yells the loudest gets the most attention, and that person winds up in power. And our founding fathers didn't trust democracy for that very reason. And so they preferred a republic because they didn't trust you guys. Now, a republic is still a democratic form of government, but it's not a pure democracy. In a republic, citizens rule, sure, okay, we can call it that, through elected representatives. The idea was that there were a number of well-educated, intelligent, and rational people in our country. And those were the people that need to lead our country, not the rabble-rabble. So, if we trust the people enough to elect from a select pool of educated, intelligent people, they get the feeling of democracy and representation, and we get the stability of a rational and intelligently led government. Now, it's not just wool over the eyes. This idea, it's called republicanism, goes back for a very long time. And it's an idea that we have a government based on the consent of the people. In fact, one of the prominent thinkers at this time, John Dickinson, said that this idea was based on a feeling called nationalism. That ideally, voters should put the needs of the nation above their own needs. But again, you've got to consider the Federalists who didn't trust this idea. The Federalists weren't so sure that people would put the needs of their nation above their own concerns. Because, I mean, really, anybody else use social media? Do we see voters putting the needs of the nation above their own selfish interest? I don't know about you guys, but I don't see it. And so a lot of people were concerned about, should we trust the American people? Should we allow democracy to function? However, Adam Smith, who developed the idea of capitalism based on his book, The Wealth of Nations, said that a republican form of government will function because people will look after their own self-interest. You know, Adam Smith wasn't naive to say that all Americans are simply going to think about what's best for their country. No, they're going to think about their own self-interest. They're going to be entirely self-motivated. And they're going to pick people based on what they want to see happen, not what is good for the country. And Adam Smith said that's how capitalism works. That our selfish interest will benefit the whole in the big picture. Meanwhile, as states formed their own constitutions, you see, there was no U.S. Constitution until 1789. But we declared our independence in 1776. Britain recognized our independence in 1783. So what about those mystery years? There's that little, wait a second. So we won the war in 83. We got our Constitution in 89. Washington became our first president in 89. So what about between 83 and 89? What happened? You know, I don't know if you've read the Old Testament. There's this scary verse in the book of Judges where it says, and each did what they thought was right in their own eyes. There was no system of government, but everybody did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And I read that and I'm like, that's anarchy, right? So we weren't quite there to that extreme, but each state was setting up its own system of government. Many states were limiting the power of government leaders, guaranteeing specific rights to citizens, stressing liberty, though not equality. again stressing liberty, though not equality, and we'll come back to that idea later. In most states, only white males could vote. Actually, in fact, in all states at this time, only white males could vote. And in some states, even, you had to own property to be able to vote. Now, I'm sure you've heard that when forming our country, we looked back to antiquity and studied Greece and Rome. To some degree, that's accurate. However, there were flaws in the Greek and Roman systems. Previous republican governments couldn't quite work in our context. For one, no previous democratic form of government had effectively balanced the concerns of state and national governments. For example, Rome, perhaps one of the more effective, quote, republican, and I put it in quotes because, let's be honest, most Romans were slaves, but as far as a form of government, they had a rather effective system of government. People identified themselves throughout the empire as Roman, yet the provinces, which would be equivalent to our states, never had effective representation in Rome. And as such, the provinces never felt fully represented by the central government. And in effect, they eventually rebelled and killed the Romans. And in 493, Visigoths took over the whole business. And Rome was sacked 7 times. And, it was just general bad business. And so we looked back to Rome and we said, okay, we like the idea of a Senate. We like the idea of an executive, of a judicial. We like basic elements of this government. But there needs to be a system of government that can effectively represent the Henderson counties and effectively run the United States. And that's the question. That's the million-dollar question. That's why we screwed it up the first time. And so again, how do we unite this government? And I forgot to mention the Greek model. Again, we go back to the ancient Greeks, and hey, they had a neat system too, and it's a very interesting subject to study. But they also fell apart because they had the opposite extreme. Each city-state was represented independently, and they all ran their own political units. And then we had one city-state going to war with another city-state. Gee, we had a civil war. It was called the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians and Spartans destroyed each other, and it led to a 500-year dark age. And we don't want that either. So we don't want Visigoths, ideally, and we don't want Peloponnesian Wars. So how do we find this happy medium? And that's why it really took that period called the Articles of Confederation to experiment with this. So the next question is, if we're going to effectively balance power between the states and the national government, how do we represent these states? Should representatives be based on a state's population? Purely by a state's population, which is what we have in the House of Representatives. By the way, the Great Compromise solved this problem. We now have both. The other, should each state receive an equal number of representatives, where equal power is shared. Now, Congress believed that it represented the states first. And so in the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. One vote. It's very simple, right? 13 states, 13 votes, enough said. Politics is rather simple. There were some problems with this as well. You see, the ancient Greek system was actually somewhat similar to what we developed with the Articles of Confederation. In times of war, the ancient Greeks would join together into a confederacy for the purpose of mutual defense. They could never defeat the Persians on their own, but the Spartans, with the help of the Athenians, with the help of the Ionians, of the Thespians, etc., could unite and defeat the Persians. But they all had to work together. But they only really joined together when they had a common foe. And then they'd go back to fighting each other. And so when we were looking back to the Greek model, we had to ask ourselves this question: how can we keep us together if the redcoats aren't coming anymore? How can we unite as a people if we no longer have a common enemy? And so we maintained this idea of the Confederation, that each of the 13 colonies were an alliance with a de facto national government. And the states would share equal power. So each state had one vote in this government. It's very similar to what we have at the United Nations. You see, at the United Nations, each country is represented in the General Assembly. I hope to go someday. I want to see it. It's in New York. It's a big, fancy building with flags from every country around the world in front of the building. And the idea is that every country in the world sits at an equal table, no one higher than anybody else. And everybody in the world has a right to voice their grievances. It's what I used to think of as the ideal solution. Well, the problem that we have found at the United Nations in today's world is that with each state having one vote, no one can ever agree on anything, and nothing is rarely done. And so, the founders of the UN knew this as well. And they gave certain states a special power. And we're one of them, by the way. We have a special power. We're part of what's called a Security Council. That in the interest of getting things done, we have a little more power than the rest of them. And we can kind of tell them what to do. And that's where we finally solved this problem in our country. And I'll come back to that. You see, the Articles of Confederation created laws assigning national and state powers, roles for different groups. The national government would handle war, would make treaties between different nations, would issue the mail. Yet there was no executive branch of government. You know, like I said, what was the problem with the UN? Oh, it's that every state had an equal vote. It's that, nothing was ever done effectively because no one could agree on anything. In fact, that's why the League of Nations fell apart when the Second World War started, because they could never agree what to do about Hitler. Here's Hitler killing everybody, and meanwhile this United Nations, supposed to solve the world's problems, couldn't agree on what to do about Hitler. And Hitler took advantage of that and did what Hitler does. He kills everybody. And meanwhile, no one could agree. And we had this same problem that we had back in the 1780s. There was no executive and there was no court system. And so there was no good way to interpret laws, and there was no good way to enforce laws. So Schwarzenegger would have called it weak. And finally, what about the western lands? Who would get them? You see, the 13 colonies were really just the East Coast. At this time, even the mountains here in the southern Appalachians would have been considered frontier. And then explorers were going west of the mountains and finding the Tennessee Valley and finding the Ohio Valley and finding these lush, fertile, abundant places to live. And we wanted to live there. And people were going there by the millions. But the question was, who? Who got to claim these lands? You know, do we stretch out North Carolina all the way to the Mississippi? Well, that's not quite going to work. You know, do we stretch out South Carolina all the way down to the Gulf Coast? Not really. But how do we make those decisions? Who gets to call the shots there? Now, by 1779, 12 states had approved the Articles of Confederation. Yet for it to go into effect, all 13 states had to approve. And the holdout in this case was Maryland. And they finally approved when the western land claims were given to the United States. So when all this land that the settlers had claimed, when it was agreed upon that the United States, the Articles of Confederation, would decide who got to settle where, they said, sure, we'll go with it. And it went into effect in March of 1781. Meanwhile, The Land Ordinance of 1785 created a national plan for surveying and making maps of these western lands. And then finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created a plan for creating territories out of these new lands. And the agreed upon settlement was that when a territory reached a certain population, they had the right to apply for statehood. But until then, it would just be this loosely defined territory. Now, severe problems with this system. You see, the Confederation, while popular in thought, was terrible in practice. But I want to point out it was popular in thought, because when the Southern states rebelled in 1860, they formed, guess what? A confederation with very much the same system of government. These kids never learn, do they? Now, the Confederation lacked unity. States pursued their own interest because they were not forced to cooperate. You know, it's just like you guys. If I said, well, okay, I get that you're frustrated working with people you're not getting to choose. I'm just going to let you make your own projects. There would be no unity in this class at all. There would be nothing. You guys would do your own projects. You'd probably be happier that way. But it just wouldn't work. It would take forever. We'd still be doing presentations from 2 weeks ago. The point is that sometimes you have to be forced to work with one another, or it's just not going to happen. And that's the trouble we had here with the Articles of Confederation. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary War, while tons of good stories come from it, created a huge national debt. Sure, France helped us. Sure, Spain helped us. But they needed that money back. They weren't just helping us out of kindness. Yeah, they wanted to stick it to the British. But also they were making investments, financial investments, in the future of our country. And investments expect returns. They needed that money back, and we owed that, unfortunately. And so we had acquired huge debts. So to pay for these debts, it was decided that we would impose taxes on imports. These are called tariffs. And that's what Congress decided. Okay, so we're going to make a tax. It's going to be on imports. It won't affect Americans at all, except it's going to be a tax on imports. So it will actually be a tax that other countries will have to pay. Okay, it's going to make your goods more expensive, but it's going to avoid all taxes. It's the only tax you'll have to see, and it's going to pay off our debt. And that's what Congress said. And they're like, we got this really good idea. And guess what? Everyone was, okay, let's do it. We'll pay off our debt. And then Rhode Island said no. And everybody's like, Rhode Island, come on. Do it already. We got to pay this debt. Rhode Island, come on. And Rhode Island was like, no, we're not going to do it. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, they're throwing their papers, they're kicking stuff. And they're just angry because they're like, come on, Rhode Island, we got to pay this debt. But unless everyone agrees, nothing gets done. And so they're just like, oh my gosh, they're pulling their hair out. That's why they wore wigs at that time. Because unless an amendment was approved by all the states, it wasn't happening. Yeah. And you wonder why their life expectancies were short.
States having to agree on them.
Meanwhile, how do we collect taxes? How do we have any form of national currency? These things have to be answered before we can even have a country. Meanwhile, creditors, that is, people who loan money for profit, were okay with the idea of high taxes because they wanted to be paid back. You see, where did America accrue all of this debt from? Well, a good chunk of it was from people who had loaned America money. Personally. That means American colonists had loaned America money to fight this war. And they wanted that money back with interest. And they had an interest in seeing that their money was paid back with interest. And so they were okay with the idea of higher taxes. But the taxes put farmers in debt. In fact, many farmers lost their lands because they could not pay these taxes. Many farmers lost their property because they could not pay these taxes. Because guess what? When this all fell apart, it was a farmer who led the charge. His name was Daniel Shea, called Shea's Rebellion. So this all fell apart because of a farmer who had lost his land, and a lot of other farmers had lost their land, and they became angry about these taxes and they revolted. True story, and we'll get to that later. Meanwhile, the debtors, those who owed money, wanted a large supply of paper money. The creditors wanted a small supply, and that has to do with the value of currency, and we'll get into that later. Meanwhile, the United States could not pay its debts because we could not decide a good way to collect our money. Well, this is going to upset a lot of people. When you can't pay your debt, you get in lots of trouble. When a nation can't pay its debt, that nation gets in lots of trouble. In fact, when Greece defaulted on its loans just last year, Europe got to decide how Greece was going to repay their loans. They got to tell Greece what to do. They said, you're going to stop doing this, this, and this, and you're going to put that money towards your debt. Greece lost their freedom in a big way because they couldn't pay their national debt. This has happened many times. When the United States could not pay back its debt, Britain maintained forts and garrisons all along our border. They said, we will station soldiers on your border until you can pay your debts. Spain also. We owed Spain money. And Spain actually, in response to us not being able to pay off our debts, closed the Mississippi River to American navigation. They said, you can't pay back your money, you're not using our highway. Period. And so they had these measures in place that they could impose without having to declare war to hurt us financially. Westerners were unable to ship crops east through New Orleans, so the Mississippi River is still today an important trading route, and it was closed by the Spanish. And meanwhile, Congress was unable to resolve these problems because they had no power to do so.
It's 1781. The states are all fighting. No one has the power to get anything done. The Articles of Confederation turn out to be a blueprint for political disaster. So, what exactly were the Articles? Many of us vaguely remember them as America's original Constitution, the flawed prototype for our federal government, right?
No one thought of them as a constitution. The states had constitutions because the states were the sovereign entities.
The Articles were explicitly designed to have a weak central government and very strong state governments.
Under the Articles, the 13 original states aren't states as we know them today, but more like independent sovereign nations. There aren't 3 branches of government like we have today either. What little power there is wielded by the one and only branch, the Congress.
The revolutionaries wanted to keep the Congress very limited in power for fear that it could become another British Parliament, and whatever power the states would give to it, it might turn that power against them. So they made sure that the real power of government remained on the state level.
Instead of passing laws that the 13 states must obey, the most Congress can do is ask pretty please. The biggest disaster in this flawed system is the economy. 13 different paper currencies flood the country, fueling runaway inflation. Unregulated tariffs push prices sky high. And the central government is always broke, since it has no power to levy taxes.
And so at every level, from Congress to the states, to the towns, to the individuals, people are strapped. And this is one of the reasons why that a new way of thinking about the form of government, the authority of government, and the way in which revenue should be raised becomes central to the questioning and the revisioning of the Articles of Confederation.
But for those Americans desperate for food and jobs, a debate about fixing the government isn't enough. They want to take the whole thing down. In 1786, a former captain in the Revolutionary Army, Daniel Shays, leads a mass revolt against the government and attacks the Federal Armory in Massachusetts. It takes the battle-scarred Massachusetts militia to finally put down the rebellion. But a new wave of uprisings seems like a sure thing, unless Americans can come together and agree on how to run the country.
So the first government said something has to be done. We either have to strengthen or replace the Articles of Confederation with something that is more workable and not as weak.